in research, the approaches to reducing impaired driving and reducing alcohol problems is in 3 levels. There's called the first one is prevention. It's preventing or reducing the misuse of alcohol. So if you do that, then that follows that you'll reduce impaired driving and violence and so on. The second area is enforcing impaired driving laws, such as saturation patrol, sobriety checkpoints, arresting drivers for driving under the influence. The third approach is sanctioning the DUI offenders to make sure that they don't recidivate. All right, so those are the 3 approaches. This approach, the prevention of alcohol misuse, is, believe me, the toughest one to do. All right, we do pretty well in enforcement in this country. We do pretty well on sanctions for DUI offenders, but in trying to control the misuse of alcohol, it's very, very difficult. I think you all know why. I hope I'm not preaching to the choir today, because I'm going to try to convince you that this is a good strategy, first of all, but I think you already know that. But I want you to think about whether this would work in your community when I'm finished, okay? All right, here's the title. Now, I have to say this. We did this for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They have the final report. It has not been published yet, okay? They're still reviewing it, but this is the reference if you need it. That's the contract number and so on, and I think these slides will be available so you don't have to scramble and write things down. But the report has not been released yet, but NHTSA has given me permission to give presentations on the results because they do want to get the information out to people. So this is the 2nd or 3rd time I've done this. I have to acknowledge people who helped on this. We did this project in 2 different cities, Rochester and Cleveland. These are the people who were in Rochester and in Cleveland who actually conducted the program. We evaluated it and we got the data for it, but they actually did the program. And I have to have this disclaimer that everything I say here is my opinion and not the Department of Transportation, okay? Okay, the problem. Legal drinkers, age 21 to 34, all right? They're high-risk drinking drivers. They account for close to half of fatally injured drinking drivers when you look at the data. The proportion of that age group who are intoxicated in fatal crashes is higher than any other age group. It's higher than the underage, it's higher than the older drivers. So this is a very tough nut to crack, this group. And that's why NHTSA wanted to go after this group. Binge drinking is very high with this group. They go to bars or they have parties and they binge drink, get intoxicated. And if they reach BACs of 0.15 or greater, the odds are 2,000 times greater of them being killed in a single vehicle crash compared to a 21 to 34-year-old at 0 BAC. So tremendous odds that they're going to be involved in a crash. And measures have not been effective on this group. If you look at the data, we've made really good progress since 1982. We've seen a decrease. Now it's leveled off for the past 15 years. But the decrease is mainly in the underage and in the older drivers, not with this group. This group has remained pretty much the same as far as the proportion of drivers in fatal crashes who are intoxicated. Now, studies of the place of last drink of impaired drivers, I think you know this, show that anywhere from 40 to 50% are coming from a commercial establishment, a bar or a restaurant or sporting event. The service of alcohol to visibly intoxicated patrons is prohibited in every state or local ordinances, except Florida, Nevada, and Wyoming. Those are the only states that don't have a state statute, okay? Every other state has some sort of statute that says it's illegal to serve an obviously intoxicated patron. Now, each law is different, and in most states it's very difficult to prove that the person was visibly intoxicated. So it's a very tough law to enforce. And research on the effects of server intervention programs, such as responsible beverage service training, on patron alcohol intoxication is mixed. And I'll go over the data on that. Here's a systematic review that was done by Jones and others recently, 2011. The effects of server intervention on patrons' consumption is mixed, they said, looking at several studies. And some studies in the review showed positive effects on reducing intoxication rates. Others showed no effects. So this was a report, a review of the literature, and said the evidence is mixed. But there was one good study, and I'll move over here now so I can see it better. It was done in 1994. Jim McKnight, who worked at Pyre a few years ago, he did a study in Michigan. Intoxication of bar patrons was found to be associated with selling doubles, triples, beer by the pitcher, and so on. They did observations and discovered that. And therefore, responsible beverage service training, ABC enforcement, was conducted in one Michigan county, and then a neighboring county was serving as a comparison. And they showed that denial of service from pseudo patrons increased from 18% to 54% after the training. Pseudo patrons are patrons who are trained to act intoxicated. They're not really intoxicated. They act like it, and then they try to get a drink and they see if the bartender or the server will still serve them. So the denial of service in that study went from 18 to 54%. That's remarkable. First of all, to start out at 18% is remarkable. You'll see in my experience, we didn't have that. Okay, also he found the proportion of drivers arrested for DUI coming from bars declined from 32%. 32% of the DUIs came from bars before, 23% after the training. All right, more literature, Toomey and Wagner, 2001. They had 5 bars in Minnesota receiving responsible beverage service training, and they looked at underage sales, and that decreased by 11%, and pseudo-intoxicated sales decreased 46% compared to control bars. So these are studies that show positive effects. And then right here, the Institute of Public Strategies did a study in Ventura using place of last drink. Bar risk assessments were conducted. They went in and observed what was going on. RBS training was conducted, and there was a steady reduction in bar mentions by DUIs after that study. And Pacific Institute, where I work, in 2007 did a study in the state of Washington where they had place of last drink, responsible beverage service training and enforcement. The DUI arrests from the intervention establishments was decreased by 36%, which you can see at small numbers, 11 to 7. The average BAC of arrestees went down, and there were several lessons learned, but they found out that, for example, to let the bar know that they were doing the enforcement, merely sending a letter doesn't do it, all right? Most of these managers or bar owners just throw the letter out. They don't even read it. So you have to deliver it personally. And we found that out in our study too. You have to persuade establishments to receive RBS training for the most part. They don't really want to do it, but you know, if it's mandated, then they'll do it. And conducting sales to pseudo patrons right after the training is important. You really want to do that and see if the denial of service is there. All right, so given the literature, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was still very interested in this particular strategy. There were other strategies like designated drivers, alternative transportation, things of that nature, but they wanted to see if this one would work. And so they sent out a request for proposal, and we got proposals from Monroe County, New York, that's Rochester, and Cleveland. And one of the criteria that they had to have was either a place of last drink for DUI offenders or calls for service where it was near bars. And so in Rochester, they used place of last drink, and in Cleveland, they used calls for service. We identified 13 problem establishments. That is, they were listed multiple times by DUI offenders. So and now these are big cities, all right? So 30 out of 300 bars or so. We identified 30. We randomly sampled 10 to be intervention bars and 10 to be control bars, and then the remaining 10 would serve as substitutes because there may be, some of the bars may not cooperate, which turned out to be the case. So we needed that other 10, and we knew that was going to happen. So in the intervention bars, what we did was we sent warning letters, first of all, that they've been mentioned multiple times by DUI offenders, we're going to be looking at you, we're going to be watching you, and we want to provide you with free responsible beverage service training for all your managers and your servers and your bartenders. We're going to conduct enforcement, and we're going to issue citations if the problem continues, all right? So the bars, the intervention bars got all of that. The control bars, the other 10, no letters, no RBS training, no enforcement, but we collected data. We did pseudo-patron surveys and we did bar patron surveys at those bars who did not receive any of the RBS. And then we had comparison counties, just in case something was going on in that state that would reduce impaired driving, DUIs, or alcohol consumption. So we used Onondaga County, New York, to compare to Monroe County, which was our intervention county, and Toledo, Ohio, to Cleveland. Now, this is what we had to do. First of all, we had to gain cooperation of the bar managers, and not all the bar managers were real happy about this, okay, as you can imagine. And some of them turned us down flatly. They said, no, you're not going to be doing surveys outside my bar. I'm not going to take the training. You're not going to do it. A couple of them were strip bars, and we couldn't use them because we had females who were pseudo-patrons, so it really wouldn't work at a strip bar, so we couldn't use them. So there are certain bars we couldn't use. We collected baseline data at the intervention and control bars and in the intervention and comparison communities. We visited the intervention bars, a personal visit by the ABC or the local police. We offered free training, and then we said for everybody who you hire after we do this free training, for everybody you hire, there's an e-TIPS training. I don't know if you've heard of TIPS. It's a responsible beverage service training program. Well, it's on the internet. It's interactive on the internet. And we offered that for anybody they would hire during the next 12 months. We conducted the training, and then we conducted 3 alcohol enforcement visits over a 7-month period. We wanted to do 3 visits, because the research shows you got to do enforcement about every 3 months, otherwise it decays as far as people being in compliance. So we collected our, we collected data before we started, and then we collected a first post-intervention data after the first enforcement visit, and we collected the second one at 12 months. So there was an enforcement visit 3 months after we did the training, and then another enforcement visit, and then another enforcement visit at the end, and that was when we did the last one. And then we evaluated the effects. Now, I don't know what kind of training you have here, but my experience is that the responsible beverage service training is different in every state. In Ohio, it's called the HELP program, Higher Education for Liquor Permits. Very clever, isn't it? That's what they used in Cleveland. In New York and Rochester, it's called Fundamentals of Alcohol Intoxication Recognition, or the FAIR program. That was in New York State. But be that as it may, we made sure that they went over the signs of intoxication, because that was what we wanted to emphasize, that you need to know the signs of intoxication, and you need to intervene at that point if you see somebody who's too intoxicated. And so these were some of the things we taught. Loss of dexterity, fumbling with their billfold, their change, or drinking glasses, the balance, stumbling, propping oneself up, slipping from the bar stool, poor distance perception, overreaching or missing a chair, slurring of speech, hostility, threatening people, bad language, and just lack of inhibition. Intruding on strangers and so on. So we taught them all these signs, and then we said, now, if you see those signs, here are some of the things you can do. Offer food, provide alternative transportation if they're driving, cutting them off, enlisting help from their friends if their friends are there, serving water or soda on the house free so that they don't continue drinking alcohol, measuring drinks rather than just pouring them like a lot of bartenders do, checking IDs for underage, and then as a last resort, I'm sorry, sir, I'm going to have to call the police. All right? Now that didn't happen in any of these, but that's what you teach them. So again, we collected before and after data. We compared the 10 intervention bars to the 10 control bars. We compared the intervention treatment communities to the comparison communities on other measures. And we had 8 different outcome measures on this, and that's more outcome measures than I've ever seen in any of these studies. So this is probably the most comprehensive study that's been done on this. At the bar level, we had pseudo-patrons before and after in both the 10 intervention bars and the control bars. And they would fake being intoxicated. We had bar observations, covert enforcement visits by the ABC officials. We had breath test collection from bar patrons outside the bars when they were exiting the bars. And we looked at calls for service at or near the bars to see if that changed before or after. At the community level, we looked at self-reported impaired driving by drivers at DMV offices. We had a paper and pencil survey at DMV offices at both sites just to see if anything changed. We looked at DWI arrests of the 21 to 34-year-old drivers. We looked at police-reported alcohol involvement in crashes. And then we looked at, this is called the surrogate measure of impaired driving. We looked at single vehicle nighttime crashes where alcohol prevalence is high compared to, or as a ratio to, multiple vehicle daytime crashes where you don't see alcohol involved very much. So we did all of that. We did 3 ways of data collection, pre-intervention, before the program started, at the first post-intervention wave, right after the first intervention, the training and the enforcement at the intervention bars, and then a second post-intervention wave was after the third enforcement visit by the ABC officials. And again, I say ABC officials here. It was ABC officials in Rochester in New York, but it was local police in Cleveland. That's just the way they do it. The local police enforce the alcohol laws in Cleveland. All right, so in Monroe County in Rochester, we trained students to fake the intoxication, whereas in Cleveland, they actually had out-of-work actors who did this. And we used 3 males and 1 female. We made 8 pseudo-patron visits in each wave to each of the 10 intervention bars and each of the 10 control bars, pre, first post, second post. And we recorded any service refusals and attempts at intervention, okay? The pseudo-patrons did that. Question?
Yeah. How did you determine when to do the pseudo-patron interventions or the tests? A particular day of the week or night of the week, or did you vary it? How do you know when to conduct these surveys?
Yeah, we varied it. We varied it. We did it mostly though on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday because that's when that's when they're busy. Okay, the bars. But we did some during the week also. But we made sure that we made eight visits to each site.
So a quick question: did they go in looking intoxicated, or did they go in?
No, because you didn't want the bouncer to throw them out, immediately. So they went in okay, and then when they got to the bar or got to the table, that's when they went through their act.
But did they get served a certain number of drinks before they started acting intoxicated? So
They didn't drink. They would order a beer, and if they got served, they would just leave it and leave. But they were looking for any sort of intervention, all right? So they waited around a little bit just to see if nothing happened, then they left the beer in the bar and they left. And we had, one, as I said, one female, because we wanted to see, we think some servers are biased, and they won't deny service to females. So we wanted to see if that happened.
Were they sprayed with alcohol or anything to give them
No.
odor?
No. No, as a matter of fact, and I'll talk about this later, the actors probably overacted, okay? The students did what we told them to do, okay? So, well, I'll get to that in a minute. These are the problems with doing real-life research, okay? All right, so, all right, now, we did bar patron. Bar patron BAC collection, and we interviewed them, too. So we had, as I said, gained cooperation of the bar managers, and there were a couple of bars that wouldn't do it, so we had a substitute. We sent a data collection team, 1 manager, 2 data collectors to each of the 10 intervention and 10 control bars. We interviewed bar patrons exiting the bars. We offered $5 for them to talk to us. We asked them a few questions, and then we got an anonymous BAC with a breath tester that did not record the result at the time. We downloaded it later on. Now, many of them said, "What's my BAC? What's my BAC?" Well, we don't know. You know, we said, we don't know. We don't know what it is. We're going to download it the next day. Now, if any of them were severely intoxicated and they said they were driving, we wouldn't let them drive. All right, we called a cab, or we had one of the data collectors take them home. And so we got 45 patrons at each bar during each wave. All right, all the 3 waves. We got 45, and it took 2 nights usually to collect that in those bars. And again, it was Thursday, Friday, and Saturday mostly. I think we did a couple of Wednesdays, but that was it. Now this is Lance. This is he's an ex-law enforcement officer. Can you tell? And he didn't collect the data for the bar patrons, but he was there just in case anything happened with the data collectors. And then this is just a reenactment of what we did. We would, you know, the bar patron would come out, we'd talk to him, and then we'd have him answer a few questions and then give us a breath test. All right, so again, there were 8 questions that NHTSA, the sponsor, asked us to answer from this study. The first question was, were there any significant changes in the service practices in the intervention bars versus the control bars, as measured by the pseudo-patron in bar assessments before and after, okay? So that's the mainly the pseudo-patron information. Were there decreases in the number of place of last drink mentions among bars in the intervention group versus the control group? That was the second question. The third was, were there reductions in the proportion of 21 to 34-year-old patrons leaving the intervention bars intoxicated compared to the control bars by BAC level? The fourth question was there a decrease in the number of calls for service from pre to post intervention, comparing the intervention to the control bars? The fifth question was, were there decreases in the proportion of 21 to 34-year-olds in the general population who reported driving after drinking too much? Now, the reason that was in there was we thought this was going to get a lot of publicity, and we were hoping it would kind of serve as a general deterrent in that community. It didn't get any publicity. Neither site got any publicity. They tried, but they really didn't get any. So we didn't see anything right here in this one. Was there a reduction in alcohol-related crashes, injuries, or deaths among 21 to 34-year-old drivers in the treatment versus the comparison community? That was question 6. And then commensurate with the RBS program, was there a decrease across each treatment community relative to its comparison community in the ratio of single vehicle nighttime crashes to multiple vehicle daytime, especially with 21 to 34-year-old drivers? And then finally, was there a reduction in the proportion of drivers arrested for DWI who were aged 21 to 34 before and after? So that's what NHTSA was interested in. They wanted to see whether we would find any evidence of effectiveness by answering these 8 questions. All right, so these are results. I have to say preliminary because it hasn't been released yet, but I can tell you what they were, and it's not going to change. The data is not going to change. So in Monroe County, this is Rochester now. Relative to the control bars, the change in average BAC of the bar patrons went from 0.097, so almost 0.10, to 0.059. That's good. That's a good result. But that happened in the second wave, not in the first wave. There was no change in the first wave. But in the second wave, after the 3 enforcement visits, then we saw that change. And there was a change in the odds of being intoxicated, that is 0.08 or greater. They were significantly reduced in the intervention bars during the second post-intervention period, but not the first. So that's the first big finding in Monroe County. Then from pre-intervention to post-intervention, the intervention bars had a significant reduction in the number of calls for service relative to the control bars. So fewer calls for service in the intervention bar, near the intervention bar, which means fights and stuff like that. And there was a significant drop from 53% to 45% in the proportion of 21 to 34-year-olds arrested for DWI after the intervention in the intervention community compared to an increase in the comparison community from 49% to 51%. But here are the overall results. This is addressing all 8 questions. There was no change in an attempt at intervention with pseudo-patrons. There was no intervention at all in Rochester by any of the bars, the ones trained or the control bars. Nobody intervened with the pseudo-patrons at all. There was no change in the place of last drink mentions in Rochester. There were significant reductions in patron intoxication. We talked about that, and even in the proportion of 0.15 or greater. And there were quite a few at that level leaving the bar. There was a significant reduction in the proportion of 21 to 34-year-olds arrested for DWI, a good finding. Significant reduction in calls for service near the intervention bars, I mentioned that. Significant reduction in self-reported driving after drinking too much. Whether that had anything to do with the study or not, we don't know, but that's what happened in Monroe County versus the other county. And there was no change in self-reported intoxication in bars before driving. In other words, we asked people, would you avoid driving in the future if you became intoxicated? And there was no change in that before or after. And unfortunately in Rochester, New York State held out on their crash data and they wouldn't let us examine the crash data. So we had no crash data in Rochester, yes.
At what point in time did you collect the place of last drink? Was it collected at the time of arrest for DWI? Was it collected
Yes.
in the jail, or was it collected at
It-
the treatment program?
In Rochester, it was collected at the time of arrest. The police officer asked it. They routinely do that. They've been doing it for years. In Cleveland, they didn't collect that. There was calls for service that we used. All right, so in summary, this is what we found. So there were some good results in Rochester, not all, and we certainly wanted to see what the crash data showed, but we didn't have it. So in bar graph form, here's what the main finding. This is bar patron intoxication, okay? Intervention bars are the black bar, the control bars. And you can see pre-intervention, the control bars had a lower percent to begin with, you know. And they actually went down a little bit, but it was not significant. Now, with the intervention bars, no change here in the first post, but then a big change in the second. And the reason for that was that in the first post intervention, the ABC agent didn't tell the bar that he visited them in the enforcement visit for 6 weeks, all right? So they didn't even know that he was there observing. And so nothing happened, and you would expect that. But in the second one, he visited the very next day and said, I was in your bar last night and I was observing you. And so that's what happened there.
So the question then, does the enforcement not really involve citations? It was more about stating their presence and.
There was a citation.
Okay.
I'll go into that, yeah. I found, this is funny, are there any ABC officers here? I found in Rochester, in New York, the ABC agents were very reluctant to do this. They didn't want to do this for some reason. In Cleveland, they were a little more enthusiastic about it. The local police were doing the enforcement. It was really hard to get the ABC agent to agree to do this. And we had to pay them extra and so on and so forth. So it's not an easy thing to do. But anyway, this is what happened. That was one of the main findings in Monroe County. All right, now Cleveland. Cleveland, hooray. The refusal of service rates for pseudo-patrons went from 3.6%. Now in Rochester, it was 0 to 0. There was no intervention. This one went from 3.6% pre-intervention up to 27% first post-intervention and then 21% after the second. So at least we got some denial of service in Cleveland. Yeah.
Those were the out-of-work actors.
Those were the out-of-work actors, and we think that had something to do with it. Yes. Yes.
Now, so this is just refusal to service, not the other interventions like offering alternative beverages? Or,
It included that.
oh, this
Yeah, it included refusal of service and any intervention that they tried to do. Yes, yes, yes. Now, you want to see that, you know, the McKnight study went up to 50%, but they started out with some denial also. But of course you want to see that at 100%. That's what you want to see, but at least we got this significant finding here. Our regression analysis showed that the odds for refused service to pseudo-patrons were the same pre-intervention to post-intervention in the control bars, whereas the odds of refusal were significantly higher in the two post-interventions in the experimental bars. Oh, wait a minute. Let me go back. Is that the last bullet? I guess so. Okay. Okay, so there was a overall significant increase in refusal of service, significant increase in the attempted intervention with pseudo-patrons, that was included in there. Significant changes in the average BACs in the proportion of bar patrons with 0.08 or higher in the intervention bars, pre to first post, but there was an increase in the second post. I'll explain that. No change in the proportion of patrons at 0.15 or greater. Significant reduction in self-reported being intoxicated in bars before driving. No change in alcohol-related crashes. We did have crash data in Ohio, and no changes in single vehicle to multi-vehicle. Now, we really didn't expect to see a change in the alcohol-related crashes. I mean, after all, it's 10 bars where you're doing this out of 300 or 400 bars in each city. So we really didn't expect to see it, but what we wanted to see was the bar level stuff. And we did see something. And we did see at least a reduction in intoxication in both cities. And we saw a denial of service, probably because of the out-of-work actors acting a little more drunk than the students did.
Well, if you don't see a reduction in the one county in refusal of service or increased refusal of service, why would you get a reduction in intoxication?
Just, I guess the servers followed the rules and they didn't overserve.
Just in general?
Yeah, I mean, the students probably didn't show the signs enough, okay, to get denial of service, but because they received the training, they didn't serve them as many drinks or whatever, or they did food or something.
And because of enforcement?
Yeah, well, and mainly because of enforcement, yeah. Yeah, it's the enforcement, believe me, that made the difference here, and I'll go into that in a second. Yes?
I think you should be able to tell the data from what years.
Yeah, we tried, believe me. I used every avenue I could to get at that data. Pardon? Well, I didn't. No, I didn't. I didn't ask the governor, but we tried everything we could to have them release that data, and they just don't do it until they're happy with the data. And at that point, we had to do the analysis, and at that point in time, they weren't happy with it, so they wouldn't let us have it. Yes.
Sir, what's the reasoning for alerting the bar staff that you're coming and even paying them and then asking their permission to stand outside and take a survey? Because it just seems that this is a public thoroughfare and you're able to ask anybody anything you want, and if you observe them coming out of the establishment, because it just seems it's so easy to bias that if the staff know you're coming and you're doing the research, even though I've seen studies where they've done that and they still just completely overserve. It's just interesting that we're going to them
Well,
proactively. And
some of the bars were in public areas where, you know, we could do it. But some of the bars that were in private property, were parking lot. We did it in the parking lot, all right? And we found that if you don't get the bar manager's permission to do this, they will come out and throw you out, all right? They will say, leave my property. It happened the first time we went to a bar, and we had to exclude that bar. But we just found that you had to get their cooperation in order to collect the data. Anything else? Okay. How am I doing on time? You okay? Okay. All right. So in Cleveland, in a bar graph form, this is what it looks like. This is the denial of service before, and then the first intervention and the second intervention. But see what happened in the control bars? That went up too. okay? The denial of service went up. Now, it started out higher, you know, no difference here, but it went up. And we think what happens is these bar owners all talk to each other, okay? They all talk to each other. They say, hey, something's going on. You better be careful. And sure enough, that's what happened in the control bars. So it does go beyond what you're doing. All right, so discussion. All right, Monroe County, delayed effects probably because feedback to the bars on enforcement visits came 5 weeks after the visit in the first, okay, in the first post-intervention. Feedback was immediate in the second, and it was personal. So that's why we think that happened after the second. Now in Cleveland, we think the immediate effects were probably due to the aggressive enforcement in the first post period. There were on-the-spot arrests were made. The officer arrested a bartender for serving someone obviously intoxicated, right in front of everybody. And it got around. And so we think that's what happened there. Conclusions, there were some indications that RBS training plus some enforcement can have an effect on bar patron intoxication. In both sites, the proportion of bar patrons who were intoxicated decreased. The RBS training and visible enforcement may be an important strategy in combating impaired driving if there is more widespread implementation in a community. As I mentioned to you earlier, if there's a community that would be willing to do this, you've got place of last drink, we identify the bars and multiple, okay, I've got a taker back here. Good. See me after. I want your card because I will apply for a grant with the NIAAA on this, and I'll tell them, here's the pilot study, here's what we're going to do in this community, and we're going to go to every problem bar in this community and do this, and give them the training, and then do the enforcement. But we'll have to have letters that say we're going to do it, okay? The police have to say that. So. All right, and I can't say enough about collecting place of last drink. From what I could see in San Diego County, you do more than most communities in this country on this issue. And a lot of your communities collect place of last drink. We've been trying to convince police to do this for 30 years, at least 30 years. They're reluctant to do it. I'm not sure why. I think they think that DUI arrestees lie to them. They probably do. But if a bar is mentioned more than 3 or 4 times, it probably is a problem bar, okay? So even if some of the mentions are wrong, and this is what the bars complain about, oh, that person was too drunk to know that he came from my bar, or that person got drunk in another bar, not my bar, all right? That's what they all say. But, if you get multiple mentions, you know that they're a problem bar. And by the way, our research shows that in most communities, 90% of the bars are pretty good. They don't overserve, they don't serve underage, they're pretty good. It's 10% of the bars that are the problem. And I've even seen research where 50% of the DUIs come from 10% of the bars in a community. So, yeah. Okay. Recommendations, if you're going to replicate this. Obtain support from community leaders pre-intervention. See, that's another thing we didn't do. In Rochester and Cleveland, we didn't have a coalition, we didn't have a task force, we didn't have anybody, all right? It was just these 2 groups who were willing to implement this strategy. And if we'd have gotten community support from community leaders, I think it would have gone better. We also would have gotten publicity, which would have helped. Train local police officers to collect place of last drink data and conduct alcohol enforcement in the bars. There aren't enough ABC agents. I know of no state that has enough ABC agents to be able to really do this and do it well. So I think we have to get local police involved in it. And I also know that a lot of ABC agents, they have other duties. I know local police do too, even more so. But I know the ABC agents, they have to look for cleanliness and in the kitchens and stuff like that in order for the people to keep their license, and that's what they do routinely, and it's difficult for them to do the alcohol enforcement. Involve law enforcement in the process of contacting the bar owners. So if you have law enforcement with you and you say we're going to do this, they usually comply. They don't want any trouble. But if you go in as researchers and you don't have law enforcement with you, then they throw you out. Personal visits by police officers after the enforcement waivers is better received than letters, so you really do have to make a personal visit and say, I was here last night, I was observing your serving practices, you know, you better not be serving obviously intoxicated people or underage. And obtain better cooperation rates and training. Now, we did train everybody in those 10 bars, okay? But we gave them this e-training, the web training certificates, and we said, now every person you hire, we want them to take this. Turns out 3 people out of all the people, you know, out of all the 10 bars in both cities took the e-training. So obviously they didn't do that. And our local people didn't track that, and so we didn't know it till the end of the study. So anybody who came on after the initial training weren't trained, all right? And you've got to make sure everybody's trained. So you've got to do the web-based training. And as I mentioned, attempt to get earned media publicity, because if you get that, then all the other bars will start doing some good things. Limitations, small number, only 10 intervention bars. You can't really expect a big community effect on that. The pseudo-patron acting may not have been consistent. That's an understatement. Very few e-tips passports were used. That was the e-training. Some selected bars refused to cooperate. Substitutions were used, but I think that's going to happen. And crash data was not available in Monroe County. Now, this is what Jim Mosier says, you know, laws to crack down on serving intoxicated people in bars are largely ignored. He's right. He's right. It's a very difficult issue. But I think it'll have an effect if we could do it in a community. So here's my precaution again. The final report and the journal article are currently under review, and so the results are considered preliminary.